Hello, everyone, and welcome to the May session of my 2026 free oil painting series. This month, we will be painting this sweet little bird, which is referenced from this photo by Max Grindel Photography on Pixabay. I've posted the link in the description if you'd like to download the image and follow along. This lesson will be completed in 3 stages: the sketch, color blocking, and then details and finish. And there are a variety of materials for this sketch, but we will be painting on an 8x10 canvas panel and using a limited color palette. For the first stage, I have started by toning the canvas with burnt sienna and then creating a sketch. And I've posted the sketch here so that you can pause and screenshot if you'd like to follow along, which I really hope that you do. And then once I've toned the canvas with that thinned down burnt sienna, I just wash it on there and then I wipe it off with a shop towel. I use charcoal to transfer my sketch to the canvas, and then I like to take a thinned down Gamma-Sol that's a little bit darker than what I use to tone, and I go through and outline the canvas again. And what this does is it helps me to, once I've sketched the painting and then outlined the painting on the canvas, it helps me to become familiar with the shapes. I start to think through which areas I'd like to work on first, and I start to think about where I'm going to put my darks and my lights. So you'll notice that I've made some adjustments and some changes from the reference photo. I wanted to make the bird larger on my own canvas, and I wanted to make sure that the bird was the focal point. But what I really loved about the reference image was the bird, kind of the singular bird on the branch with the gray behind him and that little peak of sunlight coming from around. So I know that I definitely want to situate the bird so that it is the focal point of the photo, and so that that peaking of sunlight will become the unifying kind of bit of the painting. And you'll see what I mean by that as we move forward. So what I'm doing here is I'm just making sure that I have my basic outlines. I'm looking at where the main separation for the feathers will be. I'm also thinking about the markings on the face, and I want to be sure that I've created registration marks for myself so that when I go through and I start painting, I know where those areas are going to be, and then I can build up and develop those areas with more form. So the outline is very important to my own process for paintings like this where I am using some kind of reference. Once I have these basic shapes down, I go back and I start to think about my areas of dark and my light, where I will have those darkest colors and where I will have those lightest colors. And I like to plan that out at the sketching stage, of course, using the reference photo, because this helps me to think about how I'm going to approach the painting and how I will move forward with the stages of the painting itself. So in our tutorial, we'll do stage 1, color blocking, and then we do detail, and then we go from there. But for the actual color blocking, I want to think about where those colors are going to lay. And so this is one of the reasons why in these tutorials I spend so much time looking at the color blocking and thinking about these areas of dark and light. One of the things that you'll notice on the reference image is that the branch itself has several different areas of dark and light as well. So I'm going ahead and I'm thinking about where these are going to be. So we know that those areas that are in shadow will be the darkest, and those areas that are on the top of the branch closest to the light source will be the brightest. So I want to try to emulate that the best I can in the sketch. Once we finish the sketch, we're going to move into color blocking. And color blocking is where we want to, using the approximation of the colors, try to replicate as best we can those colors that will come up in the painting. So we don't have to be perfect. It's not going to be super detailed at the color blocking stage, but we want to be sure that we get every area of the canvas covered, and we want to get the colors in the area that they need to be. So one way that I like to start these alla prima paintings, and the alla prima painting is where you do the painting all at once, or you do the painting in one setting. One of the things that I like to do is always start with the background. So for this background, I have mixed a bit of Mars Black and Titanium White with a small amount of Prussian Blue, because I want this kind of steely gray color to start the background tone. I've also mixed in a little bit of Liquin, which I'm actually just barely touching my paintbrush to the Liquin off camera. I don't put it on the palette because it obviously would slide down. And then I'm mixing these colors together so that I can start to lay them on the canvas. And for the background, I want this kind of bokeh background, or having the colors very muted and soft and intermingling. What I'm doing is I'm mixing the different colors in as I continue to refresh that pile of color. And that's going to help to make sure that I have variation in my colors, and that I am able to have those areas of dark and those areas of light in the background. So I spend a good amount of time just very carefully coming in and putting this background around the figure so that I can start to settle the figure into the background when I paint. I like to put the background in first because when you study color theory and when you start to learn more about different kinds of colors, you very quickly see that what the color looks like on the palette is going to be very different than what it looks like on the canvas, depending on what colors are around it. So if I were to completely paint the bird and then go in and put in the background, it would change how I'm viewing the colors in the bird. So if you know a lot of color theory, then you can approximate or estimate what that background will look like. But if you're new to painting and you're just starting out, putting the background in first is helpful, because then as you're painting the bird, you will automatically make those adjustments to go along with the background. So I find that as you're learning, as you're experimenting, as you're going through the process of color mixing and seeing how colors interact and seeing how the paint brand that you use interacts as well. These are Gamblin colors, Gamblin artist oils, that you will this will become more second nature to you. But a good tip that I can offer when you first start is putting that background in first. So you can see what I'm doing here is I've got some areas that are darker, some areas that are lighter. I'm looking at the reference photo and just approximating where these areas of dark and light are, and thinking about how I can replicate that on the painting. Now you'll notice as I am painting that I am putting darker colors, or the darkest of my paint mixture, in the corners, and I'm putting the lighter colors towards the middle. I do this so that I keep the eye in the painting and direct the eye towards the focal point of the painting. So when we have the darker colors in the corners, what we're doing is making sure that the eye doesn't leave the painting. Sometimes when we have those brighter spots, the eye tends to kind of go towards those brighter spots to see what's happening, and we can risk kind of losing the eye. But by having the darker colors in the corners, we frame the painting somewhat very subtly and we have the eye bounce back up to the middle. So you'll see that these lighter colors surround the bird, and I'm also thinking forward to that peep of sunlight that I want to have coming through the feathers on the bird, and having those lighter areas with the darker on the edges. And these are very, very subtle color shifts. As I am moving into the lighter colors, you'll see that I'm mixing more blue in with the white, a black mixture, which gives it this really kind of nice steel gray color. And you don't need to worry about having the colors in the exact perfect spot, because once I have laid down all of the background color and I've adjusted it to my liking, I'm going to go and blend, and you're going to see it's going to give it a really soft kind of subtle effect. Here you can see where I'm going back and I'm just adding a bit more dark to the edges and thinking about, have I brought up this dark far enough? I'm also adding in just a bit more light in some areas so that we're framing the bird nicely. And so as I mentioned, this stage is it's not meant to fuss over. It's, you just want to kind of get that color down, and you can always go back and adjust it later. In order to blend the colors together, I'm just taking a mop brush and circling it, doing very, very small circles, and this is going to knock out the brush strokes, and it's also going to help to move those colors around so that they seem more soft and more natural. And you can kind of think about what that would look like if you were looking at this bird against the sky backdrop, or maybe if you're peering at it into some really dark leaves or some really dark foliage, you just kind of see the color versus specific shapes. And so I'm blending this, and my main goal is to just knock those brush strokes out, and to make sure that I'm not seeing any specific line work or any specific shapes. I've decided to go ahead and add just a little bit more dark to the color. Be very careful when you're adding white. Of course, I was looking specifically for a gray here, but be very careful when you're adding white into black, because it gets very difficult to get back that true black color. So if at any point you are finding that you're not getting the color you want, just take your palette and wipe it down and put out some new colors and start again. A very, very common thing that happens when you are just starting and you're just learning is you might do something called mud mixing, where all of your paints kind of start to blend together and take on the same kind of muddy look. And when that happens, just stop, take a breath, wipe down your canvas, clean off your brushes, put out some new paint, and you could start over. So it happens, especially as you're learning the materials and you're learning the process. I'm using a larger blending brush here, and this is really where you're going to see those brush strokes just disappear, and barely touching the canvas, and just making sure that I am wiping those colors away. You want to be aware of not over blending too, because you don't want to lose all of the good work that you've done. And I probably over blended just a bit, but I really like the effect that it had. If you go a little bit over your outline, that's okay, because you don't want to have super harsh edges in your painting. This next part of the painting, I am putting down some basic colors, some titanium white, yellow ochre, Prussian blue, and Mars black. And I'm going to start laying the base colors for the bird. And as I do this, I'm starting off with this is a small painting. This is an 8x10 canvas. So I want to have just a small amount of paint. I accidentally moved my brush through the blue there. So I had to stop and clean up, as I mentioned. I like to try to keep as clean as possible when I'm painting, but with oil paint, that's not always the case. To create the underbelly colors, I'm adding in yellow ochre with a small amount of white, and I'm adding this white in to just kind of brighten up that yellow ochre a little bit. We don't want to completely knock the color of the yellow ochre out, but we do want a more subtle yellow. Also, you want to be careful with this blue background or with this kind of bluish black background, because if you mix the yellow in while everything is wet, especially with yellow ochre and Mars black, you have a tendency to make green, which can be really pretty. It's a really nice color of green for foliage and eye color and things like that, but we don't want it in our bird today. So that's one thing you'll want to be careful of. If you are afraid of mixing the colors together too much, you can always do the background and let it dry for a day or two, especially if you use Liquin, and then you can come back and you can paint the foreground in or the focal point in. So I'm looking at the photo and I'm just thinking about where those areas of yellow are. So definitely in the underbelly, in the upper wing, we have a nice stripe of yellow, and I'm not worried too much yet about giving it form. I'm just kind of getting those basic yellow colors down, and then I'm going to come back and I will add more detail into this color blocking stage. But right now I just want to get all of those basic colors in so that we're starting to see what we're working with here. And so I've added just a hint of that black in, and just to desaturate the color just a little bit. You don't want to put too much in, because as I mentioned, you will get that green color, and we want to avoid that as much as possible. I did decide that I wanted to go ahead and mix with the burnt sienna instead, to see if I could get that more vivid yellow color, that more desaturated yellow color. At this point, I am mixing in the burnt sienna with the yellow to give it this kind of orangey brown color, and I'm going in and I'm starting to think about the forms in the shadow. So as I mentioned, the first thing I wanted to do was kind of get that area covered. Now that I've got the area covered, I'm going in and I'm thinking about where those areas of form are. So the darkest color is going to be what's furthest away from the light. So anything that's on the underside of the bird would be darker. Anything that would be kind of sunken in. So we're thinking about like the area behind where the wing is forming, underneath anything feather, where the feathers go over, and we would have that area of light underneath is also where we would put these darker colors in. And so just looking at the reference and also just thinking about the anatomy of the bird, if you have a chance to bird watch, or just kind of put out a bird feeder and sit and watch birds, they really are quite fascinating, and their bodies are actually quite complex. So I wanted to do credit to the bird by making sure to highlight the kind of beauty of the body of the bird. So thinking about these areas of dark and light, thinking about where the divots and the high points of the body are, can be really helpful in offering more detail. You'll notice that right at the edge of the bird on the breast towards the middle of the underbelly, I'm leaving that bright stripe of yellow because that's where we're highlighting that part that's closer to the sun. Once I have worked on the underbelly, I'm going to start going in and adding the dark colors on these blue feathers. And to do this, I'm mixing in Prussian Blue with titanium white, and I'm adding just a small amount of red. I don't want to add so much red that I get a purple, but I do want to add a little bit of red to kind of desaturate that color just a little bit. And so you can see that as I add in the white, I'm naturally having some different tones here. So we have the darkest dark of the Prussian Blue, we have where I've added the red in, we have the white, and then we have kind of a mid-tone as well. And I'll be working from these various values to put the feathers in and to start to create form in the feathers. I'm also creating a small pile here where I have added a bit of red and a bit of Mars black, and that's just giving me a really nice, dark, rich blue. Very seldom do you want to use the paints out of the tube just as they are, unless you're looking for a pure white or a pure yellow ochre. Adding in colors and mixing brings depth to the painting, and the more variations of color that you can offer, the more realistic that you'll see. Because if you were to look at a bird, the bird may be red or blue like a cardinal, but there are going to be different types of red in that cardinal, and there are different types of blue in this small bird as well. So this is where I'm going back in, and I've mixed over the background just a little bit, but that's okay because I can still see my outline. And so I'm just going in and I am reaffirming those shapes and bringing them back out. Now I'm continuing to work with that darkest shade and putting that darkest shade under the wings, in those areas that are farthest away from the light or that need to have the most depth for the bird. So this area under the largest wing is important to have that darkness too, because that is where we would have that little bit of kind of space where the wing touches the body of the bird. I also want to be sure that I'm bringing some darks into the feathers at the back, because by putting in these darker lines, and they're going to get smaller as we blend, it will give us the appearance of the separation of feathers, the shadows between the separation of feathers. Take your time as you go in and you add these shapes. I've been trying to keep these tutorials around an hour, just because I want this to be something that you can watch through and then follow along with. So if you need to pause or slow down the video, please do so. Take your time, especially as you're learning. It takes time, and you're thinking through as you're putting these strokes down. It's not just a mechanical one for one, but you're thinking through the object. You're thinking through the form and the shape and the feel and the texture as you do this. And just like with writing, with creative writing, it just takes time to allow yourself to think. As I am going back in and adding in what we would call the mid-tones, I'm putting just a little bit more white in, and I'm getting a lighter blue. It's not a light blue, but it's kind of that medium blue. And I am starting to lay that down, mostly next to the areas of dark, and starting to build that form. So you can see that we have those dark areas, we're adding in these mid-tones, and we can start to see the feathers taking shape. So we have the shadow underneath the wing, we have the lighter colors, and we'll continue to build that by changing the colors, thinking about where the element is in relation to the light, and continuing to build that. I have an even lighter shade of blue here, And if you notice the outside of the wing where it's the thinnest and it's catching the light has that light color, so I'm leaving that here. I'm starting to add in those very light stripes on the upper wing as well. I know there's a name for it, but we'll just call it the upper wing. If you guys do know what the specific anatomy is, please let me know in the comments. And as the oil paints blend together, they naturally are creating those separations for us, and we're going to go back in and highlight those and bring some of that out. But you can see how this is what I love about oil paint, is that it does some of the work for you by making these beautiful blends and these beautiful color mixtures. Now, as I mentioned previously, we want to be careful of the yellow, because if we mix too much of the yellow and the blue, we're going to get a green color. Mars Black also it tends more towards the blue, so that's why you get that beautiful green. But we want to try to avoid the green as much as possible. So if that's probably the biggest challenge of this painting, is not mixing green unintentionally. I have a few tutorials where I have used a lot of green, in the boats tutorial, and also in the elephant tutorial and the orange tutorial. We have 6 full tutorials now on the website, on the YouTube channel. So if you'd like to practice making green, that orange tutorial or the boat tutorial is probably going to be the most fun, but we do want to avoid it here. Now I've mixed an even lighter, almost white blue here, and I'm going back in and I am swooping in at the top of the head. And remember, we're going to have that peak of sunlight, so we really want to have the brightest colors right on the edge of the bird, and that's going to make all the difference for us as we move into detailing in the later stages. I'm continuing to mix the white and thinking about the kind of mask that the face has. If you do not get the forms or the shapes right at first, don't worry. You're going to see that I have a little bit of back and forth as I'm adjusting. I'm looking at the reference image. I'm measuring a little bit with my brush on the reference image, just to make sure that I have those areas in. And sometimes we just need to refine the lines. We need to add the dark back in. So be patient with yourself if the first brush stroke that you put down is not the perfect brush stroke. Oil paint is wonderful because you can go back in, you can keep working, you can keep blending. If you do find that you're mixing mud, you can put a shop towel on it to pick up some of the excess oil, or you can let it dry and come back the next day. So with this lightest blue that I've mixed so far, I'm going back in and I'm starting to think about individual feathers. We're still not drawing individual feathers, but we're thinking about the shape. So what I'm doing here is there's a beautiful kind of stripe on the bird's wing here. I'm putting in just where the color band would go across for that stripe, and I'm also putting in some of the stripes for where the feathers are ending on the other side, because on the front side we see the outside of the wing, on the other side we see the inside of the wing for the bird, which would be the outside that I'm working on now. And I'm going back in and I'm just laying more of that dark color, just to give a bit more form and a bit more dimension underneath this bright stripe. I also want to add in this darker color, and I'm adding in a little dark lines to start to give the illusion of feathers. When you're doing this, you want to be sure to try to avoid a pattern. Our brain wants to make patterns. Our brain wants everything to be nice and in order and orderly and even and equal, and we want to try to avoid that. So don't make all of the stripes exactly the same size, exactly the same width. Just kind of go in and put some variation there. And it can be a challenge to do that because we're fighting against wanting to put in, you probably have heard this if you've watched a lot of tutorials, but drawing what we see versus what we think we see. So our brain is going to tell us, oh, those feathers are orderly, like we would see in like a children's color book or something like that. But what we want to draw, what we're seeing, which is nature has a lot of variation. It has a lot of kind of quirky wonkiness, and that's what we're aiming for. I'm adding more into the dark spot on the head and then bringing that feather up just a little bit more. And so you'll notice as I'm at the color blocking stage, the integration of the top of the feather into the back is not seamless. It looks very kind of blocky, but that's okay because we're approximating color and we're getting the canvas colored at this point. You might need to go back in and add those darks a few times. Think about the sizes and the shapes. It can become very easy. If you've ever done an exercise where you need to draw a circle and you kind of keep back and going, adjusting, you'll notice that your circle gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. You can do this very, very easily with little objects like the wings. I sometimes do this when I'm doing portraits. I'll make, as I'm blending and as I'm adding colors in, the cheeks will get bigger. So you always want to be going back in and checking those proportions as you're adding in these colors, because the wing can get a little bit bigger than it needs to be if you're not careful, if you're not watching out. I'm stippling a bit of dark in here too, because I'm thinking about how the shadow would be underneath the wing by the tail feather on the underside of the bird, and I want to bring in just a little bit more of that color and a little bit more of this kind of highlight underneath the wing where the light would be hitting. Well, it's actually not underneath the wing, it's more like on the belly of the bird. So I'm looking at the reference image and adjusting as I move forward, going back and forth between the yellow and the blue and just adding in these colors. There are some really pretty spots of light on the back of the bird too, so I want to start adding in those spots of light, and this is where we really start to see the dimension take off, because we're starting to add form by having the highest areas being the brightest and the lowest areas being the darkest. So you can see that just adding that little stripe of whitish yellow automatically brings up the back of the bird so that it starts to look a little bit rounder. And this is just basic shapes here. We're not adding in the details. Once I've got the bird mostly covered, I want to go in and start working on the branch. And so in order to start the branch, I've put down the burnt sienna, and I'm mixing the burnt sienna actually into the darkest blue mixture here, because when you mix burnt sienna with Prussian blue, you get a really pretty dark brown that is almost a black. And our darkest area of color in this particular painting is going to be the underside of the branch, because the branch is brown, and then that would be in the shade. So I'm starting by adding this darkest area of color underneath the branch, and by doing this, this is going to give me the base to add the form to the branch. If I start on the bottom and it's darkest, and then I have a mid-tone in the middle, and I have the light area where it's closest to the sun on the top, it's going to naturally make the branch appear round. So as I'm painting, just think about, and as you're painting this, just think about where the area of dark and the area of light would be. As I'm continuing to work on this branch, I am adding in more burnt sienna and less of the blue black burnt sienna mix to slowly lighten up the color. I'm also adding in a small amount of white, yellow ochre, and burnt sienna to continue to lighten the color and to move the color towards a more kind of sunlight feel. And this is because as I'm working on the branch, as I've mentioned, the lightest area should be on the top, the darkest area should be on the bottom. And by creating a gradation of color, we're creating a form in which the branch appears to be rounder and appears to be taking that rounder shape. I'm also mixing in just a bit more white to bring this to a more kind of light brown tan. And just thinking about the texture of the branch and the shape of the branch as I'm adding in these colors. I'm also being a bit more loose with the way that I'm laying down these tiles of color, because the underlayer here is going to help to emulate the feel and the texture of the branch. So when you look at a branch, it's never completely smooth. It always has bumps or ridges or maybe bark coming up, and adding in these little kind of pops of jagged looking uneven color helps to mimic that. So you see that I'm going in and I'm putting that light color, especially on the end of the branch itself where it would catch the sunlight, the top, that little nub, and then I'm adding just a few little strokes of the lighter color to the mid area and a few little strokes of the darker color to the top to start to kind of create those divots and those bumps and the different kind of surfaces that a branch would have. I'm also adding in just a bit more of that yellow ochre to continue to lighten up for the very, very top part. As you're adding in these divots and bumps, don't go too crazy and don't overdo it by creating a pattern, for example, like having 1, 2, 3 in each section. You want to try to make it random and you want to make it very subtle. So just 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 little swipes will be enough to start to add that form, and you can always go back in and add in more later at the detail stages. The last piece that I want to integrate here into the branch for the blocking stage is to bring in a bit of the background color. So whenever we are creating a painting, we want to unify the colors by having the colors from other areas of the painting appear throughout. So I want to bring in a little bit of this kind of grayish blue from the background and from the bird into the branch as well. So I'm mixing that and I'm putting this in the lightest areas. And what that's going to do is it's going to help to, as I mentioned, unify the color palette, but it also sets the branch within the painting in a more solid way. So what I mean by that is it makes it look more natural because it's reflecting the colors around it. So whenever you are painting, a good rule of thumb is to always try to have 5 variations of color in each object. And so like this branch, you'll see it has 5 different variations of browns and reds, and it's got blues, and it's got the burnt siennas as well, and to have it reflect and have each object reflect the colors. And it doesn't have to be super noticeable. It's just something very, very subtle to just bring that color in. So we just have this line here on the branch and on the edge of the branch, and it just sets it back into the painting. And you're going to see that as we add in more of this color, as we add in more of these elements, it just begins to look more and more realistic. As I've mentioned in the previous tutorials, my goal was to make a manageable tutorial in a manageable amount of time so that you could watch the tutorial and come back and follow it. However, as you continue to learn and as you continue to paint and as you continue to build confidence in yourself as a painter, you're going to find that you want to spend more time than just an hour on a tutorial, and allowing yourself to go in and explore, continue to work very slowly, add in details, make changes. Maybe you want your bird to be green, or maybe you want your bird to have more black and red tones. You can make those changes. You can spend time with the painting, and it just gets better and better and better and better as your skill level increases. So everything that you do is good practice, and everything that you do is going to help you improve for the next painting. So of course, we always want to have a beautiful finished painting, but also just remember that you're learning, you're improving, and you're having fun, which should be most important, because there's something to be said about challenging ourselves and concluding and finishing a challenge that is really great, because at the end of the tutorial, you have taken a blank canvas and you'll have turned it into a work of art and something that shows the time that you spent investing in yourself, which I think is really important. So don't be afraid to take more time than an hour in these paintings if you want to let it dry, if you want to stop and you want to come back. But also remember that it's practice, and it's one way to help you improve. I recommend painting once a week if you're able to. A few times a month is good, because what that's going to do is that's going to allow you to continue to practice those skills and to develop a bit of motor memory with the painting process. So you're going to learn about how the colors mix together, how they blend, what colors make what when you mix them, and it's also going to help you just become more familiar with your tools. So you want to be painting to where you're wearing your brushes out, and don't be afraid to use your paint. If you buy good paint, use it. Don't save it until you're at a certain skill level, which I've known a lot of beginning painters to do. Use the paint. I'm using Gamblin artist oils for this paint, and I started myself with the student grade, and then I switched to the artist grade, and I found that there is a good difference, and the colors are more saturated, and you use less paint, which is really great. So as you're investing in yourself, you're investing your time, you're investing your money in the supplies. Get the best supplies that you can and practice with them. Don't save them. Don't be afraid of messing up. For our next stage, we are going to go in and add the details. And in this particular tutorial, I have allocated about half the time for these detail stages, because once we've done this basic color blocking, it's the details that are really going to make the painting come alive and to make the painting resemble a real bird as much as we can, right, for this stage in our painting. So the first thing I want to do is to start to think about feathers and feather texture. I'm pretty happy with where we ended the branch for the blocking stage, but I want to have more detail and more form in the bird itself. So I'm starting with the beak, and I am just thinking about that reference, thinking about the sun and how the sun is shining in a very diffused way behind the bird. I'm putting a highlight of this very, very light blue, titanium white mixed with the Prussian blue on the top of the beak. And I'm using the smallest brush that I have, and I want to show you here what it looks like, to add in some little small lines of plumage, those little lines of feathers, to help me as I move forward. Now, this particular brush that I'm using is one that I have absolutely used past its endpoint. And if you looked at the close-up that I showed you, I think it's got like 4 or 5 little hairs on the end. So I wanted to show you guys that because it is important to not throw your brushes away. Even when your brushes get beat up and dragged down, they're going to be good for something. And so when I started to paint these feathers, I thought, oh my gosh, I have this one brush that only has a few hairs left on it, and I'm going to use that to start to paint these feathers. And so what I'm doing is I'm kind of mixing in these light colors, and I'm going in and I'm thinking about how the sun will be hitting these feathers. I've also added in a bit of a white highlight for the eye, and of course that's going to be refined as I move forward. But my goal is that I don't want to have a straight line that is separating the bird from the background. I want to have soft edges, and I want to have a bit of overlap so that the bird itself is not just something that looks like it was copied and pasted onto the background. So adding in these kind of small details, having these small lines is really, really helpful with that. I'm also going in and adding in some of the wisps of white into that darker spot on the head to give more of that feather texture as well. And I've actually switched to a small detail brush here, and I'll post what the size of the brush was in the description below. But the size of the brush really isn't important. It's just a small kind of a micro brush. But use what you have. You can often do a lot of really great things with a few tools if you understand how to use those tools. So the more practice you have, the more you'll be able to kind of figure out what it is that you can do with these tools and these smaller brushes. I'm also going back in and I'm looking at the back of the head, and there is an area of white at the back of the head that I want to make sure to address. One of the challenges that I had when I was painting this small bird is that I wanted to be sure there was a better integration or a better movement between the areas of color on the bird so that they blended together in a more natural way and didn't look as blocky. One way that I'm doing this is taking this white and fading it out or blending it in with these areas of darker blue so that I can transition into the yellow without mixing that green that I was talking about earlier. And so you'll also notice that their feathers kind of lighten up on the reference as well. So adding in these areas will help me to kind of extend and blend these colors together without over mixing or without mixing and getting a color that I didn't intend. So you see that I'm just kind of going in, and they're very quick, small strokes. I'm not blending the paint together a lot. It's just like very quick kind of little dashes to avoid over blending, and that is starting to not only mimic the kind of texture of the feather, the design of the feather, but also it keeps from picking up too much paint. So as you're doing this, don't be afraid to stop and wipe your brush out. You'll see that I'm doing that. I'm wiping my brush on a shop towel off camera to keep the brush clean. I'm also going back in with the white that is mixed with yellow ochre, and I'm starting to add in the sunlight kind of outline or highlight where the sunlight is coming through the feathers on the bird itself. I do play quite a bit, you're going to see this, with the shading on the under part of the bird because the sunlight is coming in from between the bird's legs and under the tail, but it's also darker on the side of the bird that we see. So it took a little bit of finagling to kind of figure out exactly how I could replicate what I was seeing in the photo. And so here I'm again taking this small brush and I'm just kind of pulling out some very, very small, very quick, very wispy little dashes, and that is kind of showing some of the fuzz or the fiber from the feathers catching in the sunlight, and it eliminates that harsh line. You'll find that when you're having to do any small detail work, or I have found when I'm having to do any small detail work like this, that avoiding trying to be perfect is the best approach. So I'm just very, very quickly going in and doing it. I mean, obviously I have a plan for where I want to lay the pieces down, but I'm also not going to put too much emphasis or too much importance on every individual line. I'm looking at the overall effect of the grouping of lines together, and that helps me to kind of allow myself to loosen up and to be more free in the application of these small lines. Sometimes we can get so bogged down in the details that we lose sight of what it is that we're trying to do or the effect that we're trying to have. And having an eye for details is important. It is wonderful for those of you who would like to eventually get into photorealism in your paintings. That level of detail is needed, but for something like this, which is a quick alla prima study, having too much focus on every single line is going to, well, ruin the experience because of the kind of painting that it is. And it's also going to kind of keep you from focusing on learning how to develop the image, learning how to develop the composition, learning how to develop the colors. If you do want to let it dry and then come back and add in more of those details, I think this would be a great tutorial to do that in. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're adding in these little plumes of hair, when you're coming back in and adding in anything for the feather texture. Try to mimic the best you can the way that the feather lays. So, you want your strokes to be going in that same direction. You want them to be in the same general areas that you're seeing those colors. But don't strive for perfection, because you want to loosen up and you want to have fun, and you're going to have better results if you're not expecting perfection of yourself from the beginning. Often as intro painters, we tend to be really hard on ourselves, and I know that I tend to be really hard on myself, and when I finish something, I look at it and I try to see it with new eyes, or how somebody else would see it, because you want to catch all those little mistakes and you want to make it the best that you can. But striving for perfection can sometimes hold us back when we're at a certain stage of the painting. So you see that adding in these stripes of light on the tail feathers too, and on the feathers on the inside, have automatically kind of bumped this up and started to create that more realistic texture. Another thing that I have not talked too much about in these tutorials is personal style and developing your personal style. And this is something that is going to come through the more that you paint, but you're going to notice that there are certain things you like the look of more, or there are certain things that you naturally tend to do when you're painting. So you might like to have a more refined kind of tight look, or you might like to have more of a loose painterly style, and both are beautiful, and both have different purposes. So as you're learning, as you're following different tutorials, as you're practicing, just kind of take note of those things and see how you can push the boundaries and start to interpret the images in your own way through your own style, which is something that you'll naturally develop as you move forward. If you've done any kind of writing, you probably remember talking about voice in your writing and developing you in the piece, and that style is what's going to let someone know when they look at it, hey, this is something that so-and-so did, and you can just kind of identify that style. So these tutorials are good for helping to learn more of those technical aspects, but developing your own style is something that really needs to be done with practice and with care, and it takes time, and it's always going to be evolving. As you paint, what you paint this year is probably going to be very different from what you paint next year, which will be different from the year after. And you can see I've been very honest and open with my painting journey here on this channel. When I first started painting, and here I'm mixing in more Marsback and Prussian Blue to get those deep shades again. I started with Bob Ross tutorials, and they're fun. I learned so very, very much. And then from there, I started to push myself. And I've provided all of these videos and all of these reviews so you can see how my painting has developed over the last several years as well. Now is time to go in and to add in the legs. And I admit I probably should have done the legs at the color blocking stage, but personally I was a bit hesitant about the legs and hesitant about how I wanted to approach the legs, so I left them more towards the end. And so what I am doing here is I'm first going in with that dark black that we mixed for the bottom of the branch, and then once I have mixed the dark black and kind of put in the basic shape, which is just a line and then the hook, I'm going in and adding a bit of the lighter blue to the top of the leg and then the side of the talon that is clinging onto the branch. And so automatically that starts to give us a little bit more form. We can see there's a dark spot and there's a light spot. And then if you take your brush and you just very, very, very carefully blend those two together, you get the idea that there is some form in the leg. And I think I made that one a little bit too long, and I'm going to go back and fix that in just a little while. But where the light is hitting, that is going to be the brightest spot. So think about that as you move forward. And you don't don't be too precious with the legs, because they're really not part of the focal point of the painting. Really, the focal point is that bird and that sunlight hitting the branch. So we want to have the legs there in order to make the painting make sense, but they don't have to be perfect. As you bring up the different areas of the painting, you will notice where more detail is needed in other areas. This is why I like to work from the blocking into the details, because you're going to see that once you have the feathers looking really good, oh, now the top of the head needs more detail, or now the top of the wing needs more detail. And so you can very, very slowly kind of move about the painting so that you bring the painting up in the various areas based on the rest of the painting. And this way it will have the same level of realism or the same kind of level of detail throughout the entire painting. So I want to work on this face a bit more, and I want to bring in more texture so that it's not just a large swipe of white. So the first thing I'm doing is adding in a bit of that blue to the edges of the white, and then I'm taking this smaller brush again and I'm just kind of stippling in some feather texture so that I don't have the glaring white and I have a little bit more going on. I'm also thinking about this line of the mass markings by the eye and how I can smooth that out a little bit and set it back into the painting so it just doesn't look like a swipe of paint. And so in order to do that, I am mixing a bit of this light white, and I'm going in and having a little bit of overlap here. I also wanted to highlight the eye by giving that light swipe behind the eye and highlighting that kind of glint of light that is shining off the wet part of the eye. Also adding in a bit more feather texture with the yellow ochre, but I'm mixing just a small amount of black into the yellow ochre to almost dirty up the color, and that will allow me to put a little bit more depth into the back of the bird where we would have that feather texture. And keep in mind, when you're painting the feathers, if you look at the bird appears smooth, but when you start to look at the feathers, you're going to see that there's a lot of variation within the texture. So there are some parts where the feathers are higher up, there are some parts where the feathers are lower, and adding in these kind of little smaller swipes of color help to give the illusion of different feathers laying together on the bird. I also want to be sure to address the back of the bird. This is the biggest area of challenge that I had while painting this tutorial, because I wanted to be sure, as I mentioned, to get that kind of highlight of color, but also have the depth and the shadow that was needed on the underside of the bird. But there are also areas of light reflecting. So you're going to see that I go back and forth a little bit here, kind of playing with the colors. And this is one reason why oil painting is so great, because you can go back and forth and change your mind and add in more color and kind of blend, as long as you don't put too much paint and start mud mixing. This can be really helpful when you're kind of experimenting and you want to see what looks right. The more shading that you can offer, the more realistic your bird is going to be. Just continue to think about that variation of color. We never want to go in and at this detail stage paint something all the same color. We always want to have those variations and the mixing of the color to mimic what we would see in nature. When I'm taking the brush off the camera here, I'm dipping into a small bit of Liquin Original, and I like to use the Liquin Original especially in the Alla Prima paintings, because it helps things to dry. So I could come back if I wanted to within a day or two and do another session of painting, where if I was not using the Liquin, I would need to wait a much longer amount of time. I'm also someone who likes to put less paint down on the canvas so that I can experiment and mix, but there are lots of different schools of thought on this and how much paint is needed. I know some artists like to put more paint and not use Liquin, or they'll use other kinds of oils as a medium, and that works really, really well too. So as you learn and as you continue to grow in your painting practice, you're going to see what works for you and what you're most comfortable with. I do like to use the Liquin in the Gamma-Sol, but there are a lot of options that don't use chemicals as well. And then the only thing you would want to worry about would be the types of pigments in your paints, and you can actually get a synthetic for most things. I have started to recently experiment with using historical pigments in my painting, and that has been a lot of fun. I've been using the Rublev brand. So some of the more recent portraits that I've been painting use the Rublev brand of paint with the historical pigments, and actually I'll be posting a portrait of a young lady and a portrait of an older woman on my channel soon, and you can kind of see and compare how those pigments look as well. Going back in and I'm adding a little bit more of that lightest light white just to hit the areas of highlight, and I'm very, very happy with how adding that white highlight in at the front of the bird and just behind the bird has made it appear as if the sun is illuminating the feathers, and just continuing to add in those little bits of texture to bring those feathers to life in the last 10 minutes or so of this tutorial. After I've added the highlight to the bird, I want to be sure that I'm mimicking that same level of sun, or that level of light detail on the branch as well. So I'm adding in a swipe of the lighter color to the edge of the branch, the top of the nub, and then the very, very, very top of the branch. So we do have the shadow of the bird underneath it, but we still have that area where the light would be hitting the branch, and we want to be sure that we're highlighting that as well. And you can see here that as I'm painting, it's a broken line. I had to stop and kind of refill my branch, and that is fine. It does not need to be all one line when you swipe down, and in fact having that broken line is better because it adds to the texture of the branch. It adds to the idea that there would be bumps and grooves and bark that would break up that line, and that would give it some form and some dimension. I always like to add the lightest light highlights last, because adding them too early can tend to make the painting look more chalky, because you'll be bringing up the painting to match that level of white. So I usually try to add in the brightest of the bright highlights last, and then sometimes I will go back in and I will add a little bit more of the darkest of the darks as well, just to be sure that I have a good level of contrast in the painting. So these last little swipes of color here are just kind of adjusting that and then setting the color back into the painting. If this painting were on a larger canvas, I might use a blending brush here as well to set back some of these colors, but since it's on an 8x10 canvas and we're working on a smaller scale, I want to reduce the risk of over blending. There's nothing worse than doing all of this hard work and then over blending and taking out all of the good detail that you've put in. Here I'm thinking about the feathers on the end of this bird and how these feathers should integrate into the background. I felt that they were standing out just a little bit too proud on the background, and so I'm kind of blending in. You can see I'm taking a small brush and just circling around again to diffuse that color into the background. Since we have integrated the background colors into the bird, it pretty much disappears when we do that, and then we can go back in and refine and add more colors to the bird itself. Adding in a bit of red here to help shift this color a little bit, to help desaturate it and to give a little bit more of that kind of warm shadow color. In nature, if you look at shadows, they're never black. There's always like a little bit of blue or a little bit of purple, and adding in that red helps to tend the blue more towards the purple, which gives it kind of more of that shadow depth. And I think that it worked really well in these feathers. One of the additional challenges that you will find, and I want to say new painters, but I think it's all painters and all artists, is knowing when to stop. Because we can add in so much detail, or we can overwork something and take out something that looks really good, and I have been guilty of that so many times. So when you get to this point in the tutorial, or the point in your painting where it feels finished but you want to do something else, or you're not quite sure, take a break and step back, step out of the room. You always want to step back at least 10 feet, or take a picture of your phone and look at the picture on the phone. But I recommend leaving the room and making a cup of coffee and then coming back in with fresh eyes and seeing if whatever it was that you thought it needed or that was bothering you is still bothering you. Because we can get so focused that we lose sight of the bigger picture, or we don't really see how things are integrating together, or something looks weird that maybe isn't actually weird, or maybe there's something really obvious that we're missing that we just don't see because we've been looking at the painting for so long. So taking your time to take a step back and then coming back in will be really, really helpful to allowing you to see it with fresh eyes. If you're doing something longer than an alla prima, letting it dry overnight or letting it sit overnight can be really helpful too. I'm working on a portrait right now where I'm having trouble getting the eyes just right. So it is actually upside down on the easel in my studio, standing on its head, so that if I'm looking around my studio, I'm not seeing the painting upright. I'm seeing it upside down. That way, when I turn it back over to work on it, again, I will kind of get a fresh approach to it. I won't get used to just seeing it a certain way. So that can be really, really helpful in your home studio or wherever it is that you're painting. If you turn your paintings upside down, it kind of tricks the eye into not getting used to the way that they look. There were some really great kind of white peaky feathers on the breast, and I'm going back in and seeing if I can emulate some of that texture with a very small micro brush. And I went back and forth on how much of this I wanted or how well it worked. So sometimes you just have to put it in and see if you like it, knowing that you might take it right back out. And this is another reason why stepping back and looking at your work from afar can be really helpful. In these last stages, just continue to think about the anatomy of the bird. Continue to think about where you can add in the form, and look into the background. Since the background is still wet, it's very, very easy to go back and blend. If you still have some of the background on your palette, you could just kind of run a soft brush through it and then go back in. What I'm doing here around the legs especially is I just want to make sure that I've covered up all areas of the canvas and that the legs are integrated into the background, that we have those soft edges. So I'm just barely touching the canvas with my brush here to set everything in. I want to be sure to go back under the branch as well, because I noticed that there was a little bit of messy line work there. Looking at the top of the nubs and just kind of blending and integrating everything in. There are different types of brushes that you can use: synthetic, hog hair, and for the work that I was just doing, I'm using a very, very, very soft synthetic brush, and now I'm using a blending brush to kind of bring some of this white back out onto the canvas. Here I am going back in with the synthetic blending brush to get that area of highlight and that area of sun here through the canvas as well. These final touches can be so much fun because you're really making the piece come alive at the end with these small little swipes and small little kind of curls and cues, and Painting hair on a portrait can be really fun for the same reason. If you're painting a landscape, adding in those final grasses and flowers is just so satisfying, because you know that you're just putting the icing on the cake, so to say, for your final piece. Adding in a bit more of the yellow ochre here, where I've stepped back and I feel like I've gone just a little bit too dark in some areas, and I wanted to bring in a bit more of that orange. So here is the final piece, and we can compare this to the reference, and I think we did pretty well. Please like, subscribe, and share to help my channel grow. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you all next month. Bye, everyone.